Absolutism is a vile, insidious ideological concept. It is at the root of all the negative, hateful belief systems of mankind. All forms of bigotry and discrimination, be it racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, fascism, misanthropy, or any other form of hate-mongery conceptualizations, all have absolutism at their cores. And all these things are games of relative subjective distinctions. For an example, first comes the distinction. Green people are different from us. Then comes the absolutism. All green people are the same. Then comes the judgment. All green people are evil and inferior. Then comes the value. Green people are a threat to the things we hold dear. Then comes final solutions. Green people must be dealt with in some way. Exile, segregation, slavery, subjugation, oppression, or genocide then quickly follow. So as we can see, there is a fine line between absolutism and fascism. I wouldn't go so far as to say absolutism is absolutely fascist, for nothing is absolute. But for the most part, much of it is thinly veiled fascism. And so what's really at the core of absolutism? Clinging attachment. A security blanket of familiarity that gives people a sense of being grounded in aspects they think are forever reliable and extend universally and beyond. And based on what? Certainly not on any outside perspective. At best, it's based on a limited intelligence with a limited perspective with a limited frame of reference. And so this is what you are basing your absolutism on erroneous logical fallacies of a subjective thinking mind? If so, then one thing is for sure. You have a broken imagination. And so what is it exactly that you think is absolute? It really doesn't matter what you name or point to. Whatever it is, I will deconstruct it. One that was mentioned recently is that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Really now, is that the best you can do? So water boiling at 100 degrees Celsius is an absolute truth, is it? Alright, let's break this down, poke it full of holes, and discover all the ways that this is completely relative and subjective. First of all, any measurement value established by mankind is completely relative to the subject taking that measurement. So any kind of scale or measuring tool produces results based on distinctions that were contrived by mankind and therefore are relative to only mankind. An inch is not an inch independent of mankind. A pound is not a pound independent of mankind. And a degree is not a degree independent of mankind. These measurement values were created out of nothing by mankind and are only sustained through an agreement. So they are not based on anything inherently there in the absence of man's discriminating distinctions. It was man who decided what the default value of an inch, pound, or degree was, and it was man who contrived the measurement systems to take these measurements. Surely you don't think inches, pounds, or degrees existed all by themselves and man just discovered them, do you? If so, then by this reasoning we must deduce that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday existed independently of mankind, and man just discovered them. And you'd be surprised at how arbitrary and random a lot of these value measurements were established. In all traditional measuring systems, short distance units are based on the dimensions of the human body. The inch represents the width of a thumb. The foot was originally the length of a human foot. The yard seems to have gotten its start in England as the distance from the tip of the nose to the end of the middle finger of the outstretched hand. And if you stretch your arms out to the sides as far as possible, Your total arm span from one fingertip to the other is a fathom, 6 feet. And these kind of distinctions extend to all value measurements, area, volume, weight, all of it completely relative to mankind. So all these value measurements are completely arbitrary distinctions, and it's narrow-minded and foolish to believe that they would extend to the entire universe and beyond. There may be other sentient, intelligent, self-reflecting beings out there that have a completely different value measurement and tools that take those measurements. So who's right? No one is right or wrong because it is relative to the subjective creature taking the measurement. Although for advanced beings of supreme intelligence and wisdom, they would probably have measuring tools that are versatile and flexible in application, depending on the condition and circumstances. Because if you know anything about the universe, you know there is nothing fixed or constant. So for primitive mankind, all measuring tools and value measurements are solely relative to mankind and his immediate surroundings. Which brings us to the second point, that all the subjective measurements taken by mankind are completely relative to the contextualization the measurement is taken in. So what is the boiling point of water on Mars, Venus, Neptune, Saturn, or Uranus? What is the boiling point of water in empty space? What is the boiling point of water on a completely different planet we've never been to before? So the boiling point of water is completely relative to planet Earth. And even on planet Earth, it is not an absolute either. The boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit at 1 atmosphere of pressure. But water boils at a lower temperature as you gain altitude, go above sea level, and boils at a higher temperature if you increase atmospheric pressure, go below sea level. So as we can see, the boiling point of water is completely relative because the boiling point of water depends on the atmospheric pressure, which changes according to elevation. Not only that, but the boiling point of water also depends on the purity of the water. Water which contains impurities such as salt boils at a higher temperature than pure water. If we take the water out into space where the external pressure is zero, then water boils at any temperature at which it has some vapor pressure, which in principle means any temperature above absolute zero. So as we can see, all the immediate material phenomena and the tools and measurement values established by mankind are relative to only mankind, mankind's contextualization, and the fluctuating circumstances and conditions of the contextualization. And so what about value judgments? Is there anything absolute about a value judgment? Value judgments, by definition, are never absolute or objective. Not ever, 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 ever. Value judgments are completely relative and subjective. Values are assigned, and judgments are assigned. And who are they assigned by? Relative subjective beings that have absolutely no access to any frame of reference that could be called absolute or objective. So, of course, this means that any discourse or argumentation of issues related to absolute objectives will never even get out of the gate. It should be glaringly obvious that any value judgment is 100% subjective. No truth can be found in any of them absolutely. Go ahead and name one. No matter what you name, the opposite could also be validated. Life is a gift. Okay, and so life is a curse. Suffering is bad because it causes pain. Okay, so suffering is good because it leads to elation and transcendence. Pleasure is good because it enables gratification. Okay, so pleasure is bad because it leads to craving and deprivation. The world is a shithole. The world is a paradise. Humans are evil and selfish. Humans are good and selfless. Life is not a game worth playing. Life is the ultimate game to play. Who's right and who's wrong? Well, it depends on who you ask, and not everyone will agree. And even things that might be globally agreed upon, such as having an arm ripped off causes much pain to the body, are still relative because they are only applicable to the contextualization of mankind in the specific configuration established through the senses and thought processes that are limited to this paradigm. But ultimately, value judgments are not true or correct one way or another. They are all equally empty and non-substantial. If you want to argue value judgments, that's fine, but keep things in perspective. These are arguments of opinions, not truths. These arguments belong more in the realm of politics and sociality, not philosophy. Philosophy, much like art, is about creativity, imagination, open-mindedness, and the exploration of possibilities. Not to say that there is no place for logic in philosophy, but what philosophy doesn't need are unimaginative, closed-minded, non-creative, fascist, absolutist dictators who want to wield logic like a weapon and bang everyone over the head from some position of assumed, self-elected, objective authority. This is invasive and intrusive and completely ridiculous, considered it's all based in flawed assumptions taken as default infallible givens. If you want to assert absolutes, then please qualify and clarify how exactly you are arriving at these assertions. Denying an existence of absolutes presupposes their inherent existence, which is an assumption taken by default without any confirmation of such assumption. Without access to the necessary outside perspective, please explain how absolutes are objectively recognized by a completely relative subjective creature that has a limited frame of reference within a limited contextualization. How is a distinction of absolute confirmed to tangibly exist independent of the discrimination? So there is no such thing as absolutes, since a subjective creature can never achieve an objective perspective. And since a subjective creature has no access to an objective point of reference, there really is no such thing as objectivity. At best, there is only objectivity relegated to relative subjective circumstances and conditions, such as an impartial opinion, an unbiased point of view, or the judgment of an outsider. But even these things are not an accurate representation of true objectivity. If two men are in disagreement on a personal issue and look to an outside third party for an unbiased opinion, the third party, despite not being directly involved in the circumstantial disagreement, is still offering his outside opinion based from his own biased subjective discriminations. Even artificial intelligence cannot be objective, for it is referencing its programming for any such given conclusion. In much the same way as artificial intelligence, humans are all programmed in certain ways. Even a completely neutral person is still conditioned to the raw programming of being an organism, the identification of being a material species of a racial, gendered sexuality variety. This in conjunction with an awareness of thoughts that serve as the glue of an assumed self. So conditioning and programming are an automatic indication of relative subjectivity, and this pre-disqualifies any possibility of absolute objectivity. This without even mentioning that the five senses of perception work in tandem to produce an interpretation of what is actually there. All there really is beneath these appearances is an infinite spectrum of fluctuating energy. So we are only dealing with a description of reality and are once removed from the raw reality. How can one establish an absolute objectivity if one cannot perceive this energy directly? The energy can be experienced directly, but the awareness of it doesn't come via sense perception. And when you take into account that this fluctuating energy is a formless substance established on a foundation of nothingness, this only further reinforces the assurance of no possibility of absolute objectivity. Again, the nothingness can be experienced directly through awareness, but not through perception. And if one does become aware of nothingness directly, then it becomes abundantly clear that all appearances and distinctions are fabricated, contrived labels. In other words, all discriminating distinctions are non-substantial. Meanings, values, truths, morals, ethics, and scruples are created out of nothing and do not exist independently of the ones who create them. A self-reflective creature, such as the human, is the one who establishes such definitions. So it's kind of silly to suggest that such definitions could exist in the absence of the one who defines them. Who exactly would confirm this if there is no confirmer to make confirmations? It's similar to saying that a dream still exists even after one has woken up. So all these self-reflective distinctions, good, bad, right, wrong, up, down, left, right, past, future, have no existence without the self-reflective creature that sustains them as such. So quite obviously, there is nothing absolute or objective about them. They are completely relative and subjective. So then, what about aspects that seemingly exist in the absence of a self-reflective creature? What about the universe and nature before the advent of self-reflection? Physics, cause and effect, instinctual creatures that act and react through impulse and stimulation. Aren't these indicative of some kind of absolute objective truth independent of the self-reflective being? Well, even with this, there's still no way around it. Prove that anything, exists independent of a self-reflective observer. This is the first task of anyone who wants to assert absolutes or objectivity. Prove it and provide the evidence. There is only one thing that can be taken as a given. There is an awareness of a correlating mind. No evidence of such need be provided because the proof is self-evident. We are aware of it. Beyond this, any assertion of quality, meaning, or independent existence is assumption and speculation. It brings us back to the dream analogy. A dream can be incredibly complex. Entire worlds with pasts, laws of nature, other people and animals, narratives and context manifest and appear to be very real and out there, and yet it is all mind created. How is the so-called waking state that we call the real reality any different? The only thing that is different is that it is solidified and has intervals of continuity. But if you stick to the only things that are known for sure, all it indicates is that a mind can form an attachment to a dream position. And this isn't all that outlandish, for all of us have had dreams where we wake up briefly, then go back to sleep and resume the same dream. Or dreams where we revisit an old dream context or scenario. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that materials and phenomena exist independently of a self-reflective mind. Even so, what is absolute or objective about them? We'll also suspend the fact that absolutes and objectivity themselves are concepts solely relegated to a relative subjective self-reflective mind. So what is absolute or objective about materials and phenomena? Given that all these things are passing, transient, non-permanent, and are constantly in a flux of change, there doesn't seem to be anything absolute or objective. What is absolute or objective about materials and phenomena that pop out of nothing into existence, constantly changed, and then pop back out of existence, back into nothingness? This entire universe will one day no longer exist. So wherein is the absolute? It doesn't matter what you reference. Atoms, molecules, energy, matter, DNA, chemistry, ambiguous forces, all of it will pass out of existence. The entire contextualization of the universe with all its laws and orderings will all break down and return back to its source. So perhaps the only objective absolutes are the unchanging constant source and the phenomena of constant change that it produces. But even this would be a bold speculative assumption. What lies beyond the core foundation of a contextualization, if anything, is beyond the access of our awareness. For even total pure awareness, imagination, and nothingness may be a component of something beyond our wildest imaginings. Change occurs very slowly for a human being, but this is also relative and subjective. For the entire expansion and contraction of a universe is but a blink of an eye in the beyond cosmic perspective. So it really doesn't matter what you think about this so-called existence. No label will stick because nothing stops changing. Nothing is absolute. Even seemingly universal laws are not absolute. Duality, cause and effect, all scientific laws, whether chemistry, biology, or physics, will gradually shift and change until they eventually change so drastically they would no longer be what they once were. So there is no lasting truth. Even truths that have endured for billions of years at one point developed into such and will eventually decay out of such. So the word truth is relative and subjective and also a misnomer. A more accurate term would be a temporary aspect of functionality. That's all you have. You don't ever have truth. All you have is a temporary aspect of functionality. There is one other point to be clarified, and this concerns the paradox of, if there is absolutely no such thing as an absolute truth, then isn't this non-existence of absolute truth itself an absolute truth? This is only a paradoxical conundrum if we forget that all distinctions are imagined aspects that are only relative to the subject that imagines them as so. And this extends into all dualistic qualities in the polarity paradigm. Is there any such thing as absolute evil or absolute good? What about absolute hot or absolute cold? Absolute right or wrong? Absolute up or down? Absolute north or south? To classify anything as absolute presupposes that the aspect exists in the first place and has some kind of existence independent of the subject it defines and assigns meaning. So forget about figuring out whether dualistic aspects are absolute because the aspects don't have any substantial substance to begin with. All these aspects are mind created and have no existence independent of the mind. So absolutes do exist, but they only exist as bound conceptual aspects of a mind that imagines them as such. Independent of the mind, not only are there no absolutes, but there are no aspects to be absolute. In other words, there is no evil or good, hot or cold, right or wrong, up or down, or north and south, or truth and false. They are all imagined relative subjective distinctions of an awareness that sustains them through a mind that assigns labels, meanings, values, and discriminations where there are none. A good example is always the dream. We may have a dream where there are numerous distinctions, separations, and the appearance of absolute aspects, but do any of them have any real substance or existence? What becomes of all these things when we wake up? The same question can be posed to this thing we call the waking reality. If anything, they are aspects that are bound to a contextualization, but beyond that, they have no existence. What all imagined distinctions share in common is that they are created constructs molded from the substance of formlessness or nothingness, that which cannot be defined, labeled, talked about, made sense of, or classified. The nothingness is about as absolute can get, but we should still reserve the tendency to label even this absolute. It's as absolute as far as we can access, but since we have no way to access the inaccessible, we have no way to confirm it, and thereby cannot make such an assertion.